The sun had barely crested the horizon when Lieutenant Sarah Chen arrived at Fort Braxton for what she believed would be another routine training exercise. The morning air was crisp, carrying the familiar sounds of military life: boots marching in formation, drill sergeants barking orders, and the distant hum of helicopters preparing for flight operations. Sarah had been stationed at this base for 18 months, and she knew its rhythms like her own heartbeat. At 26, Sarah had already distinguished herself as one of the most capable officers in her unit. Her colleagues respected her tactical mind, her unwavering commitment to her soldiers, and her ability to remain calm under pressure. She had earned her rank through merit, not politics, and every decision she made was guided by her deep sense of duty to both her country and the men and women under her command. Colonel Marcus Blackwood had been watching her for weeks, a 30-year veteran with a chest full of medals and a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. Blackwood commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. His piercing gray eyes missed nothing, and his presence alone could silence a room full of seasoned soldiers. He had built his career on discipline and control, but beneath the polished exterior lurked something darker. Sarah had noticed the way Blackwood looked at her during briefings. His gaze lingered too long, his comments carried undertones that made her uncomfortable, and his requests for private meetings had become increasingly frequent. She had tried to dismiss these observations, telling herself that she was being paranoid, that a decorated officer like Blackwood would never cross such lines. But the uneasiness in her stomach grew stronger with each passing day. The training exercise scheduled for that morning was a complex urban warfare simulation. Sarah was responsible for leading Alpha Company through a series of mock scenarios designed to test their ability to operate in hostile civilian environments. 282 soldiers had gathered in the main courtyard, their gear meticulously checked, their weapons cleaned and ready for the blank ammunition that would be used in the exercise. Sarah stood before her troops, reviewing the mission parameters one final time. She took pride in these moments, seeing the faces of young men and women who trusted her leadership, who would follow her orders without question because they believed in her competence and integrity. Today's exercise would push them to their limits, but she was confident they would rise to the challenge. Colonel Blackwood approached the formation, his authoritative stride cutting through the organized chaos of pre-mission preparations. He wore his dress uniform instead of the standard combat gear, the fabric immaculate and pressed to razor-sharp creases. His medals caught the morning light, a testament to decades of service that few could question or challenge. "Lieutenant Chen," Blackwood's voice carried across the courtyard with military precision, "I need to speak with you privately before the exercise begins." Sarah felt that familiar knot tighten in her stomach, but she maintained her professional composure. In front of nearly 300 soldiers, she could hardly refuse a direct order from a superior officer. She nodded respectfully and followed Blackwood toward the equipment storage facility, a concrete building that housed everything from tactical gear to communications equipment. The storage facility was located at the edge of the training area, partially obscured from the main courtyard but still within sight of the assembled troops. Sarah's soldiers watched as their lieutenant disappeared around the corner with the colonel, most assuming it was routine military business. They had no reason to suspect anything sinister about the interaction. Inside the dimly lit storage room, surrounded by stacks of equipment and supplies, Blackwood's demeanor shifted dramatically. The professional mask he wore in public began to slip, revealing something predatory and calculating beneath. He moved closer to Sarah than military protocol would dictate, his presence suddenly oppressive in the confined space. "You've been performing exceptionally well, Lieutenant," Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a tone that made Sarah's skin crawl. "I think it's time we discussed your future advancement opportunities." Sarah maintained her military bearing, but every instinct screamed danger. "Thank you, sir. I'm committed to serving wherever the Army needs me most." Blackwood stepped closer, backing her toward a wall lined with tactical equipment. "I'm sure we can find a position that would be mutually beneficial, perhaps something that would allow us to work more closely together." The implications of his words were unmistakable. Sarah's training kicked in, her mind rapidly calculating escape routes and defensive options. She had hoped never to find herself in this situation, but she had prepared for it nonetheless. Years of martial arts training and military combat instruction had taught her that the most dangerous predators often wore uniforms and held positions of authority. "Sir, I believe we should return to the exercise," Sarah said firmly, attempting to move toward the door. "My soldiers are waiting for final orders." Blackwood blocked her path, his expression growing darker. "Your soldiers can wait. This conversation is more important than any training exercise." He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. Sarah's professional composure finally cracked, replaced by the cold fury of someone who had been pushed too far. She had spent her entire career proving that she belonged in this male-dominated environment, that she could handle anything the military threw at her. She would not let this man destroy everything she had worked to build. "Remove your hand, Colonel." Sarah's voice carried a steel edge that would have warned any intelligent person to back down immediately. Instead, Blackwood tightened his grip and moved closer, his intentions becoming crystal clear. "I don't think you understand the situation you're in, Lieutenant. Your career, your future, everything depends on how cooperative you're willing to be." Outside, the assembled soldiers were growing restless. Training exercises operated on precise schedules, and any delay could throw off the entire day's operations. Several non-commissioned officers glanced toward the storage facility, wondering what could be taking so long. Some began moving closer to investigate, their professional instincts telling them something was amiss. Sarah had reached her breaking point. Years of suppressed anger at every inappropriate comment, every lingering glance, every moment when her competence was questioned because of her gender, crystallized into pure determination. She would not become another victim, another cautionary tale whispered about in military circles. She would not let this man use his rank and authority to destroy her or anyone else. The confrontation was about to reach its climax, and both Sarah and Blackwood knew that whatever happened in the next few moments would change everything. The morning that had started like any other was about to become the day that would define the rest of their lives, witnessed by nearly 300 soldiers who had no idea they were about to see their commanding officer's true nature exposed in the most dramatic way possible. The storage facility felt smaller with each passing second as Colonel Blackwood pressed his advantage, believing that his rank and decades of military authority would intimidate the young lieutenant into submission. He had orchestrated similar situations before, always careful to choose moments when his word would carry more weight than any accusations that might follow. But he had gravely underestimated the woman standing before him. Sarah's mind raced through her options with military precision. The door was blocked, the room was isolated, and calling for help would likely result in a he-said-she-said scenario that could destroy her career regardless of the outcome. Blackwood's reputation was built on 30 years of service, while she was still fighting to prove herself in a system that questioned her presence at every turn. The mathematics of the situation were brutally clear. "You're making a serious mistake, Colonel," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "This ends now, and we both walk away." Blackwood laughed, a sound devoid of humor that echoed off the concrete walls. "You still don't understand, do you? I decide how this ends. I decide what happens to your career, your reputation, your future in this man's army." He moved closer, his hand shifting from her arm to her shoulder, then lower. Sarah's training took over completely. Years of hand-to-hand combat instruction, countless hours spent learning to defend herself against larger, Stronger opponents, and an iron will forged through military discipline combined into a single moment of perfect clarity. Sarah grabbed Blackwood's wrist with both hands, using a technique she had practiced thousands of times, but never thought she would need to use against a fellow officer. She stepped back while simultaneously twisting his arm upward and behind him, applying pressure to joints that were never meant to bend in that direction. The colonel's confident expression transformed into shock as he realized that his intended victim was far from helpless. "Let go of me!" Blackwood snarled, struggling against her grip. "I'll have you court-martialed for assaulting a superior officer." "You assaulted me first," Sarah replied coldly, maintaining the pressure on his arm. "Now we're going to walk out of here together, and you're going to forget this ever happened." But Blackwood's ego would not allow him to be overpowered by someone he saw as inferior. With a roar of rage, he broke free from her hold and spun around, swinging his fist toward her face with all the force he could muster. His military academy boxing training made him confident that he could end this confrontation quickly and decisively. Sarah ducked under the wild punch, her smaller stature working to her advantage. As Blackwood's momentum carried him forward, she grabbed his extended arm and used his own force against him, executing a perfect judo throw that sent him crashing into a rack of metal equipment. The sound of the impact echoed through the storage facility like a gunshot. Outside, the assembled soldiers heard the crash and immediately knew something was wrong. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who had served with distinction in 3 overseas deployments, was the first to react. He had been growing concerned about the prolonged absence of his lieutenant, and the sound from the storage facility triggered every protective instinct he possessed. "Something's not right," Rodriguez muttered to the soldiers nearest him. That came from where the lieutenant went with the colonel. Other non-commissioned officers began moving toward the storage facility, their professional instincts overriding military protocol about investigating superior officers. These were seasoned soldiers who had learned to trust their gut feelings, and something about this situation felt deeply wrong. Inside the storage facility, Blackwood struggled to his feet, his uniform torn and his face twisted with rage. A trickle of blood ran from a cut on his forehead where he had struck the metal equipment, and his carefully maintained image of authority was crumbling with each passing second. He had never been defied so completely, never been made to look weak and foolish by someone he considered beneath him. "You have no idea what you've done," Blackwood hissed, advancing on Sarah with murder in his eyes. "I'll destroy you for this. I'll make sure you never serve anywhere again." Sarah backed toward the door, hoping to end the confrontation before it escalated further. But Blackwood was beyond reason now, driven by a toxic combination of wounded pride and frustrated rage. He lunged at her again, this time with the clear intent to inflict serious harm. What happened next would be seared into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. Sarah met Blackwood's charge with textbook defensive technique, stepping aside at the last possible moment and using his momentum to send him crashing toward the concrete wall. But Blackwood, in his fury, had put everything he had into the attack. When Sarah's defensive maneuver redirected his force, his arm struck the wall with a sickening crack that could be heard clearly outside the storage facility. The sound froze every soldier in the courtyard. It was unmistakably the sound of bone breaking, and it came from the direction where their lieutenant had gone with the colonel. Sergeant Rodriguez broke into a run, followed by dozens of other soldiers who could no longer ignore their instincts about the developing situation. Blackwood's scream of pain and rage echoed across the training area as he realized his arm was badly broken. The bone had snapped cleanly, leaving his right arm hanging at an unnatural angle that made several soldiers sick to their stomachs when they arrived at the storage facility. His face had gone chalk white with shock and pain, and his carefully maintained composure had completely evaporated. Sarah stood in the center of the storage room, her uniform slightly disheveled, but her posture straight and professional. She looked nothing like a victim. Instead, she appeared calm and controlled, like a soldier who had successfully defended herself against an attacker. The contrast between her composed demeanor and Blackwood's broken, screaming form was stark and immediately obvious to everyone who witnessed it. "Medical assistance is needed at Storage Facility 3, Sarah called out calmly to the assembled soldiers. "Colonel Blackwood has suffered a serious injury and requires immediate attention." The soldiers who had rushed to investigate stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they were seeing. Their respected lieutenant appeared unharmed, while a colonel was writhing on the ground with a clearly broken arm. The implications of the scene were not immediately clear, but every soldier present knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to speak. "Lieutenant, what happened here?" Sarah met his eyes steadily. "The colonel attempted to assault me. I defended myself. He injured himself in the process." Her words carried across the courtyard as more soldiers arrived to see what had caused the commotion. Within minutes, nearly all 282 soldiers scheduled for the training exercise had gathered around the storage facility, witnessing their commanding officer in complete humiliation and defeat. The story would spread through the entire base before the sun reached its zenith, carried by soldiers who could hardly believe what they had seen with their own eyes. The medical team arrived within minutes of being called, their emergency response training taking over as they assessed the scene before them. Colonel Blackwood lay on the concrete floor of the storage facility, his broken arm cradled against his chest, his face pale and sweaty from shock and pain. The medics immediately began stabilizing the fracture, but their professional demeanor could not hide their confusion about how such an injury had occurred. "Sir, can you tell us what happened?" Staff Sergeant Williams, the lead medic, asked as she worked to immobilize Blackwood's arm. Blackwood's eyes darted around the room, taking in the faces of the soldiers who had gathered to witness his humiliation. Every person present would remember this moment for the rest of their military careers. The story would spread beyond Fort Braxton, becoming the kind of legend that followed officers wherever they went. His carefully constructed reputation was crumbling before his eyes. "It was an accident," Blackwood managed to gasp through gritted teeth. "Training equipment fell on me." But the soldiers who had heard the sounds from outside knew better. They had heard the verbal confrontation, the sounds of struggle, and the unmistakable crack of bone striking concrete. More importantly, they could see Lieutenant Chen standing calmly beside them, completely unharmed and composed, while their supposedly superior officer writhed in pain on the floor. Sergeant Rodriguez stepped closer to Sarah, his voice low but urgent. "Lieutenant, do you need medical attention? Are you injured?" Sarah shook her head, her military bearing never wavering. "I'm fine, Sergeant. Thank you for your concern." The contrast between the two officers was impossible to ignore. Sarah stood straight and professional, her uniform barely wrinkled despite the confrontation. Her breathing was steady, her hands calm, and her voice clear and controlled. Everything about her demeanor suggested someone who had successfully defended herself against an attacker and emerged victorious. As the medics prepared to transport Blackwood to the base hospital, word of the incident spread through Fort Braxton like wildfire. Soldiers who had not witnessed the confrontation firsthand heard the story from those who had, and with each telling, the details became more vivid and more damaging to Blackwood's reputation. The image of a decorated colonel being brought down by a young lieutenant would become the stuff of military legend. Captain Jennifer Martinez, the base's military police commander, arrived at the storage facility as the medics were loading Blackwood onto a stretcher. She had received reports of an incident involving senior officers, and her investigation would determine whether formal charges would be filed. Her presence signaled that this was no longer just a medical emergency, but a potential criminal matter. "Lieutenant Chen," Captain Martinez said formally, "I need you to come with me for questioning. This incident requires a full investigation." Sarah nodded respectfully. She had expected this moment, and had prepared herself mentally for the challenges ahead. Military justice could be unpredictable, especially when it involved accusations against senior officers. But she had acted in self-defense, and nearly 300 soldiers had witnessed the aftermath of Blackwood's assault. As Sarah was escorted away for questioning, the soldiers who remained behind began to process what they had witnessed. Many of them had served under both officers and had formed opinions about their character and leadership style. The idea that Lieutenant Chen could overpower Colonel Blackwood in physical combat was surprising enough, but the implications of why such a confrontation had occurred were even more shocking. Private First Class Johnson, a young soldier who had been part of Sarah's unit for 6 months, spoke what many were thinking. "I always thought there was something off about the way the colonel looked at female officers. Guess I wasn't imagining things." Other soldiers began sharing similar observations. Stories emerged about inappropriate comments Blackwood had made, uncomfortable situations he had created, and a pattern of behavior that had been overlooked or excused because of his rank and reputation. The broken arm had become a symbol of something much larger than a single confrontation. The investigation that followed would be thorough and highly scrutinized. Captain Martinez interviewed dozens of witnesses, reviewed security footage from around the base, and examined the physical evidence from the storage facility. The facts were undeniable. Blackwood had lured Sarah to an isolated location, attempted to assault her, and had been injured when she defended herself. Medical examination confirmed that Blackwood's injury was consistent with impact against the concrete wall, not with any direct blow from Sarah. The forensic evidence supported her account completely, showing that she had used defensive techniques rather than offensive violence. Her actions were textbook examples of appropriate self-defense against a larger, stronger attacker. The story reached the attention of General Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer of the entire installation. A career military officer who had fought her own battles against discrimination and harassment, General Hayes understood the broader implications of what had occurred. This was not just about one confrontation, but about the culture and safety of her entire command. Within 48 hours of the incident, Colonel Blackwood was relieved of his duties pending a full military investigation. The charges against him would eventually include assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and abuse of authority. His 30-year career was effectively over, ended not by enemy action or retirement ceremony, but by a young lieutenant who refused to be victimized. Sarah's vindication came swiftly and completely. The investigation cleared her of any wrongdoing and commended her for her professionalism and restraint in a dangerous situation. General Hayes personally awarded her a commendation for her actions, noting that she had demonstrated the highest standards of military bearing while protecting herself from assault. The impact on base morale was immediate and profound. Female soldiers who had previously suffered in silence began coming forward with their own stories of harassment and inappropriate behavior. The broken arm had become a symbol of empowerment, proof that predators could be stopped regardless of their rank or reputation. Training programs were expanded, reporting procedures were strengthened, and a clear message was sent throughout the command that such behavior would not be tolerated. Months later, when Sarah received her promotion to captain ahead of schedule, she reflected on the morning that had changed everything. She had not sought confrontation or publicity, but when faced with a choice between submission and resistance, she had chosen to fight. The scar on the concrete wall where Blackwood's arm had struck remained visible for years afterward, a permanent reminder that courage and training could overcome even the most intimidating predators. The story of Lieutenant Chen and Colonel Blackwood became required reading in military academies, studied as an example of how power could be abused and how it could be resisted. The 282 soldiers who witnessed the aftermath never forgot what they had seen. And many of them went on to leadership positions where they ensured that the lessons of that morning were never forgotten. The confrontation that had lasted only minutes had changed the culture of an entire military installation, proving that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against foreign enemies, but against the darkness that can exist within our own ranks.